everyone. I'm Sarah Vernon-Sturman. I'm this year's president of UPG. And I want to thank you for coming to this meeting, which is focused on the collective bargaining agreement between the Cheltenham School District and the Cheltenham Education Association, the teachers union. Before I start this, we're going to have a couple of announcements, and I very first want to invite, I lost Rebecca or Georgina, do you want to briefly make your Seek announcement?
Yeah, the mic would be great.
Just a quick commercial about a workshop that we're going to hold from SEEK, which is a Special Education Alliance of Cheltenham. Dan Perry of the Field Center will lead this workshop for families to learn the ins and outs of the evaluation process and the forms used and how to utilize the reports that are generated to identify educational needs. It's like the basic 101 about IEPs and how they are built, and like how do you basically get to that point, the parts of the IEP and the importance of each one, and ways that families can provide meaningful input throughout the IEP process for families that already have a special ed plan in place. So this is February 7th from 7 p.m. to 8:30 at the Roland Community Center. And if somebody here wants to get more information, they can approach me or Rebecca back there. And if someone watches this video later on Facebook, they can just leave a comment and I'll be checking for comments and responding to people.
Okay, so our current teacher contract was effective starting July 1st, 2016, and runs through June 30th of this year. And so since we've entered a period of negotiation for the new contract, UPG thought it would be really helpful to learn about how the negotiation process works and what the contract actually does. Because the contract impacts a lot more than we may realize. For instance, there's a foreign language committee in the district which has been discussing whether we should start introducing foreign language at the elementary school level. But currently that would be complicated to do because our contract specifically delineates a number of elementary specials classes and how often they need to be taught. And so they would have to find other time in the schedule to allow for foreign language to occur. And that would be a conversation about the use of time, and time is very much governed by the contract. So that's just an illustration of how these concepts that may seem very abstract at times do very much direct things that we as parents care about a lot. So a couple of important things before we start, and then I will introduce our speakers. As I said, we are recording this meeting. And we'll make that available. This meeting is intended to be a learning opportunity about a topic that impacts issues that people can become very passionate about. And we're really appreciative of our speakers' time and ask that everyone respect their position if they decline to answer some of our questions, or frankly just cannot, given sensitivity or confidentiality issues. Because we want to get as much information as we can and not get stuck on that. Dr. Marseille and Jack Kelly, the president of CEA, were both invited to participate in this forum or to send representatives to speak with us here, and collectively they very politely declined because the negotiation process has begun. They are completely aware that we're meeting this evening. In fact, I had a very nice email from Jack Kelly this afternoon. And they appreciate our efforts to educate parents on the process, because the more that the community understands about the process, the better this is for everybody. So on that note, I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker will be Bill Gross, who's director of the Bureau of Mediations for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And when I was asking around various places for potential speakers to talk about the contract process, and I said that I was looking for a neutral third party to talk about how the negotiation process works, people repeatedly suggested that I talk to Bill. and I fortunately got him on the phone. Bill's job is to be a neutral third party in public and private sector bargaining negotiations, and I'll let him explain more about what he and his office does when he speaks to us. Our second speaker will be Tina Valletto, who is an attorney and director of community and government relations at the Montgomery County Intermediate Union. Very importantly for our purposes, she was on the Cheltenham School Board for 8 years, and she was president of the board for 6 of those years. And as we tried to think about how to move this conversation from the basics of how contract negotiations work to the local context and historical context of how that's often happened in Cheltenham, we thought of Tina, who lived through several contract negotiations during her time here on the board, and in the process we learned that she was also a very active UPG member while she had students in the district. So thank you both for joining us tonight. And Bill, I will hand this over to you and just ask you to first start telling us a little bit about the work that your office does, and then talk to us about the contract negotiation process.
Thank you, Sarah. As she said, my name is Bill Gross. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Bureau of Mediation, which is a part of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Department of Labor and Industry. We currently have a staff across the state of 21 labor mediators. Act 88 requires us to have 25. We're working on filling those jobs. I can hire 4 more people right now. I just don't have the money to pay them or give them any benefits. So. We work all public sector contracts across the state. So as you can understand, with 500 school districts, all of whom have their teachers organized, and most of whom have at least one support staff contract, if not more, plus all the counties and the Commonwealth and the boroughs and public universities and public hospitals, it's a lot of contracts for 25 people to work. We don't represent management or labor. We're neutrals. And, we don't represent the governor or the legislature either, and in fact, we don't report to the governor or the legislature. And if the Secretary of Labor and Industry, who's my boss, asked me to tell him what someone said in negotiations, not only can't he make me, I can't voluntarily tell him. There's a law that protects us from that, because you can't really mediate a contract between 2 parties if they can't trust the fact that what they tell you is going to be kept confidential from everyone. One of the first things I tell parties at the bargaining table is, I really don't care what ends up in their contract, and that should, in fact, make them happy, not sad, because it's hard enough sometimes getting 2 sides to agree on a contract without having to make a third party happy too. In fact, if I could talk the union into giving the employer everything the employer asked for, I would. And if I could talk the employer into giving the union everything the union asked for, I would. Unfortunately for me and for the people who work for me, it rarely happens that way. We do have to do a little bit of work. I've been director of the Bureau for 18 years. Prior to that, I was principal officer of Teamsters Local 250, based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and held various offices in the Western Pennsylvania Joint Council of Teamsters, the State Conference of Teamsters, along with various policy committee positions with the Eastern Conference and the International Union for 16 years. All of our staff either has a union or a management negotiating background. You can't get hired in this job unless you bargain as a chief negotiator yourself, because we really don't feel like you can be helpful to the people bargaining a contract if you haven't been in their shoes first. I always assume when I tell people that they know what we do in negotiations, and I'll get to some of that as I talk about the bargaining process, where we come in. I want to warn you about a couple things up front. I can't talk about specific negotiations. You may want to ask me about Cheltenham negotiations. I can't answer that. The law does not allow me to answer that. I can, however, I'm prohibited by law from doing it. I can, however, talk to you about how bargaining works and what may happen in a hypothetical situation. But again, I can't talk about specifics. The last thing is, I try not to give opinions, but it's almost impossible to give a presentation like this and tell people the truth without giving opinions. I really want you to understand, if I give you an opinion, it's my opinion. it's not the governor's, it's not the Secretary of Labor and Industries, it's not really even official policy of the Bureau. Although, let's be honest, I'm the director, so if it's my opinion, pretty much the way the Bureau is going to run unless someone on the 17th floor tells me different. And if I go on too long, please cut me off, because I get started and sometimes I don't stop, but I can get boring. So we're going to talk now about how collective bargaining works. I'm going to stick to public school teacher bargaining here, but you should be aware there are differences between private and public sector cases, between school bargaining and other public sector bargaining, and even between teacher and support staff bargaining based upon different laws. And honestly, the biggest difference between teacher and support staff, if the teachers go on strike, the school closes. If the support staff goes on strike, life goes on. Most school districts work on a July 1st through June 30th budget year. And I'm pretty sure that's what it is in Cheltenham. In that case, the parties are required to start bargaining sometime in January. If no agreement is reached within 45 days after bargaining is started, but no longer than 126 days prior to June 30th, which is around February 25th of the last year of the agreement, both parties are required to call in the services of the Bureau of Mediation in writing. In practice, mediation is usually notified at the start of bargaining, and we work with the parties to make sure we have a mediation session prior to February 25th. Now, we'll also tell you that oftentimes at that February 25th mediation session, parties don't even have proposals prepared at that point. They have the meeting to meet the guidelines. Before I put a stop to it, there were plenty of people in my bureau that referred to it as a drive-by meeting. But we are available to start bargaining right away, but we can't make the parties get serious before they're ready to get serious. The parties exchange initial proposals, and then they respond to each other's proposals. And this might be a good place to address one of the questions that was sent to me earlier, and that is, we understand that the primary things to be negotiated in contract are money and how time can be used. Is there room for other topics in the negotiation? Actually, let me say that again because I wasn't on the mic. Well, actually, the parties are required to bargain over wages and other terms and conditions of employment. This can mean almost anything except things that are considered inherent management functions, such as what programs the employer provides, the use of technology, and the employer's overall budget. Now, you mentioned something about a foreign language. The union really has no say on whether they teach the foreign language or not, but the fact that they have language in there about how time is used, while they have no legal say, gives them effective say over how it works. Some other issues that are negotiated other than money and time could be seniority, discipline, and the grievance procedure. You can negotiate a lot of things about your grievance procedure as long as it ends in binding arbitration. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania requires a grievance procedure that ends in binding arbitration. You can't strike over grievances if you're a public employer in the state of Pennsylvania. Another question I was asked concerned the standard length of a contract. There really is none. I've seen contracts as short as 1 year and as long as 8 years. There is nothing that dictates a minimum or maximum. When I say as long as 8 years, there have been longer ones. I just haven't been involved in those negotiations. There's nothing that dictates a minimum or maximum term of an agreement. Although I guess anything shorter than 1 year will create problems with bargaining timelines, and so I guess 1 year really is the shortest. The length of a contract is a mandatory subject to bargaining and can be affected by economic conditions. For example, times are real hard, the district says we have no money. Well, typically a union is not going to want a long-term contract at that point because they're going to hope the economy turns around and they can get some more money later. But there are other things besides money that affect it. I was in a mediator in a district that had negotiations that went on a long, long time and had 3 or 4 strikes during the term of those negotiations. When it was done, even though it was a long-term contract that expired 2 years later because a lot of the years were passed before they settled, and what I had suggested at the bargaining table the next time was we really needed a 1-year contract without a lot of things to fight about in negotiations, just so because I wanted the parties to get used to getting to an agreement without an extended fight and get used to there was a new superintendent coming in too. I wanted them to get used to dealing with each other so that next time when we sat down to actually negotiate a longer-term agreement, they would be in a better frame of mind than they would have been at that point. And it worked because the next time we came back and did a long-term agreement, sometimes my ideas don't work, but I don't typically talk about those. Getting back to the process. The parties spent some time exchanging modified proposals and narrowing down the issues. And in most negotiations, this only goes so far. In sidebar sessions and caucuses with the mediators start. Now, typically, the mediator has been sitting in on these meetings. But you will find that mediators do very little work when both parties are in the same room. Basically because what we don't want to do, there are sometimes as a mediator, you have to tell someone, look, I'm sure you really think you have to have this proposal, but you're never going to get it, so let's try and move past it and work around this in a different way. I have no problem saying that to somebody. I don't want to say it to them while the other party's in the room because I don't want it to look like I'm on either side. I'm just trying to be as practical as possible. So, let me answer another question that came here before I explain to you how those things work. Another question I was forwarded was, why does the process occur behind closed doors? Why couldn't it be more public? And this is not a legal answer, it's a practical answer. The reason that it occurs behind closed doors is that's the only way bargaining can work. The parties are going to make meaningful progress. They have to be able to seriously consider the other side's position and make hard choices. That just won't happen in the public. Most of what happens in public, this is my opinion here, but most of what happens in public, at school board meetings, either from the board or when the union shows up to picket out front of a school board meeting, is political. It's a show. It's there not to make progress at the bargaining table, but to build up support for their position. Hopefully, from their point of view, support for their position will end up putting pressure on the other side and will help them get something. But that's not bargaining. That's showmanship. I want to say that because a big part of public sector bargaining is political. Small p, although there's always some, in the best sense it's small p. We're not talking political Democrats or Republicans. We're talking political influencing the body politic to support your position. Although sometimes there are also capital P politics involved, and until you can get past that, it makes it almost impossible to get to an agreement. Even public pronouncements away from the table create problems. For example, the union president announces to a newspaper reporter, and it gets printed in the paper, because people love to see their name in the paper, that his group will never agree to a premium share for health care. As bargaining progresses, it becomes obvious that a deal won't be reached without premium share. And in fact, in combination with other issues, an acceptable deal can be done for the union that includes premium share. The problem we have is the president is on record, because he really wanted to talk to that reporter, saying we're never going to agree to premium share. We're going to get the deal done. We always get the deal done eventually, but it just drags out so much longer and keeps everyone on edge so much longer because we have to find a way to save face for that person who made that public pronouncement. The other thing is, if they did this in public, if they did it on TV, or if the citizens could come in and watch, oftentimes in negotiations, although you settle issue by issue, nothing's settled until everything's settled. So let's assume we settle health care, and now we're moving on to wages, and we can't settle wages. Sometimes we're going to go back and say, wait, if I give you a little bit more on health care, can I get a little bit more on wages? If you've done this in public, trust me, there are any number of people in the public who are going to be screaming, wait, you told me that was settled last time. Nothing's settled till everything's settled. And honestly, sometimes you have to be, not me, because it's not my job, but in the old days when I was an advocate, sometimes an advocate has to be a little bit abrasive in negotiations to the other side. And you'll do it at the table for show, but sometimes you'll do it out in the hallway in order to make a point. And if you do that in public, the other side then has to defend their, I was going to say manhood, but that's a sexist way to say it. I'm trying to think of, pardon me? Has to defend their honor. and it makes my job harder. And another thing I always tell people with negotiations, our real goal here is to make my job as easy as possible. I bring all this up because of what happens with mediators in sidebars and caucuses. We make supposals, which are designed to move the parties without moving table positions. I'm going to try and explain that a little bit, but I'm going to try and read my notes while I do it because I'm afraid I'll miss something if I just start talking extemporaneously. Often both sides are reluctant to officially change their position. This is usually due to a lack of trust. That's not an insult at either side. There's almost always a lack of trust at the bargaining table, even when people have great relationships. Because remember, bargaining really is conflict. It's not about getting rid of the conflict, it's about managing the conflict and getting past it. Because when you can pretend with interest-based bargaining and everything else, but you have two separate sides of the table in reality coming in with different goals, and our job is to try and reconcile those goals and get something everyone can live with. But they're not all on the same page. They may all be on the same page that they want to educate children. They're not all on the same page as to how much they're going to get paid, because one side wants, it's a zero-sum game. If the union's getting more, the district is paying more, and that's not a shared interest. It really isn't. So anyhow, that's one of the reasons. The other reason is it has to do with some of the technicalities of bargaining, and that is what's an official position and what's not an official position. Parties, while they're bargaining, good bargainers always keep in the back of their mind, I might not get to a deal. And if I don't get to a deal, what comes next? And I'm going to tell you about fact-finding in a minute, but that's one of the things. You can ask for fact-finding, or the union can go on strike. If that happens, they want to be able to present their position, not as their bottom line, but they want to preserve a position so they can say, yes, officially this is where we're at, so they can present it to the fact finder. If they make an official change at the bargaining table and put a proposal in, and it's not accepted, and they go to fact finding and try to ask for more or offer less, then that's an unfair labor practice because it's regressive bargaining. And that's something, it's not just teachers, that's every negotiation you go to. And part of our job is to get past that without affecting the party's position. So when I say supposals, a lot of that is me going from one room to the other saying, suppose I can sell this to the other side, can I sell it to you? And if the answer is yes on both sides, then I move on to the next thing. If it's no, I try and find something else. As a mediator, you don't want to fall in love with your own positions. You want to continually try and find a position you can sell to the parties. And at the end of the day, if you've done that with enough issues, magically an agreement comes into place. Now, two different things can happen with that. You can have one side or the other agree to say, yeah, this will become my proposal when you agree to it, or we'll jointly agree to the proposals. Oftentimes lately, especially in long contentious negotiations, it's not going to be a deal either side wants a crow about. They've both beaten each other a lot. And you have to remember the negotiations I step into, other than the state negotiations that are never the easy ones. And so they've beaten each other up a lot. And neither one of the side wants to take credit for it, so we end up with a mediator's proposal. I don't know, you may read about those in the paper. The mediator made a proposal and asked the parties to vote on it. Let me tell you what that really means. What that really means is, I've talked both sides into accepting something. Neither one of them wants to take the blame or take the credit for making that proposal, so it becomes mine, and I'll only make it if the bargaining committees agree to recommend it for ratification. I won't make a mediator's proposal if I don't have the support of the bargaining committees, because I'm not there to make myself look good. I'm there to help the parties settle the contract. Again, wouldn't make a lot of sense for me to make a proposal that they didn't like after I've told them I don't care what ends up in the contract. My proposals are based not on who I think's right or who I think's wrong. My proposals are based on how do we get out of here and get this done so I can go home. Let's see what I missed.
Bill, you've mentioned fact-finding.
I'm
Could
getting
you
to that.
could you define that, and then maybe we'll switch to Tina for
Okay.
some local, and then go back and forth after that.
Either party can request fact. That's actually next on my list. All right. Either party can, you don't get a deal, either party can request fact-finding. If a joint request is filed, or if a request is made by either side during what mediation refers to as magic April dates, okay, magic April dates, there's a clause that the labor board changes their mind on a lot in Act 88 that says if somebody asks in the early April date whether they have to give them the fact-finding, they will. But that's normally, especially in the first year, a bad time to get fact-finding anyhow because nobody's really bargained yet and nobody's really changed their positions much. But fact-finding is granted if both parties ask for it together or if they use those dates. But most fact-findings are requested at a different time during the year. The Labor Board will ask for our recommendation on whether we think it should be granted or not, and then they'll decide whether to grant fact-finding or not. A couple things you should be aware of. Let us assume the district asks for fact-finding.
Which we did.
Okay. Well, but if the district asks for fact-finding, the first thing the Secretary of the Labor Board is going to do is call the union and say, the district has asked for fact-finding, what's your position? If the union asks for fact-finding, they'll do the same thing for the board. But the difference is, if you ask the union, they're not just going to give their position. If they are totally against fact-finding, chances are they're going to serve strike notice on the district, because once they do that, the law does not allow the labor board to grant fact-finding if the union is served strike notice. That doesn't mean there's going to be a strike, and that doesn't mean their 48 hours notice is really 48 hours. I mean, there's some real unsettled law up in the northeast part of the state. They say, we're striking you 9 months from now. That's our strike notice. And really, it's just to stay out of fact-finding. That's why they do it. Yes?
Can you define fact-finding?
Yes, so that's next.
Awesome.
Fact-finding is this. The labor board appoints a fact-finder. They don't send you a panel and you get to choose. They just appoint someone, says, this is the fact-finder for your case. Each party goes in and makes a presentation. Before that, they have to send a list of the open issues to the fact-finder, and they make a presentation on each issue. The fact-finder listens to those presentations, and since this is, I'm not a fact-finder, I'm a mediator, I'm not sure about this, I believe there's also some public feedback that comes to the fact-finder. Fact-finder then makes a recommendation on every open issue. Doesn't have to take either side's position, but can fashion their own recommendation based on the testimony and the evidence presented by the parties. The parties then have to vote on whether to accept the fact-finder's award or not. And then they have to vote again 10 days later on whether to accept the fact-finder's award or not. If both parties accept it, they have a contract. If one or both parties reject it, then they don't have a contract, and we're back into negotiations and the mediators back there. That's a shorthand version of fact-finding. When we're done, if you have more specific questions, I'll try to answer them. Yes?
Give a hypothetical situation.
Sure.
Is fact-finding a last resort?
No. If we have time, I'll get to it later. Even a strike is not a last resort under Pennsylvania labor law. The truth is, there is no last resort. If you read the Central Dauphin decision, and I'll talk about that later. Fact-finding is sometimes, if you have people who aren't very good at bargaining, their first resort rather than their last resort. If they can't, and I say this more often, although it's happened with school boards, but more often with unions, people can't control their bargaining committee, so they go to fact-finding to try and have some cold water thrown into their face. But it happens with school boards too.
Oh, wow. So is it like a separate mediator?
It's not a mediator at all. Fact-finders should not mediate. Fact-finders should listen to the presentation and issue a report and say, this is what I think. The difference, really the difference is with us, we don't care what's in the contract, and we don't worry about who has the money, who doesn't have the money, other than the fact that you can't talk someone into spending something they don't have. Fact-finders are supposed to make their recommendation based on the facts that they hear, not mediate the contract. Some of them like to play mediator.
Doesn't go checking things, they just listen.
That's correct. The parties make presentations too.
Yeah, and I can.
Let me just do a quick thing here. Sure. So, Tina, if you could, when you started on the school board in 2006,
2005.
2005. So my son was 2 at the time. My daughter was a newborn. Candidly, I don't remember anything about that period of time and wasn't yet paying attention to the school board. So could you start with sort of that context of where, what was going on in Cheltenham at the time, like who the superintendent was, and then go from there?
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. I was elected in November of 2005. At that time, Chris McGinley was the superintendent. At one of my first meetings as a school board member, he announced that he was taking a job elsewhere. And so there was no honeymoon period, if there ever is, for a school board member. We immediately had to start searching for a new superintendent. When I came on board, the last contract that we were working under had not been a very smooth process. There were some feelings one way or another, and I think that we focused on finding a superintendent at the time that would work through kind of bridging any feelings that may have occurred. Dr. Bill Kiefer was hired as the superintendent. I will tell you that during the course of his time and subsequent from that, union representation meets regularly with the superintendent. There should be a dialogue that occurs so that a lot of issues can be addressed face-to-face and in discussion. And I know Jack Kelly very well. During my time on the school board, the second contract that I sat through, we ended up going to fact-finding. I do want to address one thing about public input from the fact finder. I don't recall that the fact finder seeks any public input.
Something's posted.
It is posted that we're going to fact finding, and I believe that we had to post our document. It's like going to court, basically. You're presenting your case. The other side is presenting their case. Fact finder takes it. There's a presentation. Usually the business manager will be speaking as to the budgetary issues, if it's a budget issue that's addressed, and each side can present their case. But ultimately, the fact finder will issue a decision. Just like negotiations, the whole concept of negotiations, I remember this from law school and I've used it ever since as an attorney, is that negotiations doesn't mean one side gets everything they want. Negotiations means that each side walks away with something they can live with. It doesn't mean there's winners and losers. That's the whole point of negotiations. In a court case, when you go on to litigate a case, there's a winner and a loser, usually. If the case doesn't settle, then a party walks away and the other party gets nothing, usually. So in negotiations, the whole art is to find that middle ground. And you do it in your day-to-day life with your significant other, with your children. You're bargaining all the time in a professional setting, especially when you're bound by the public school code. There are other parameters there. But during my time on the board, during our negotiations, what Bill said is true. We tried to keep it very much, it stayed in the room. I mean, there would be things that were said outside the room, and they could or could not be true. If the person didn't have a seat at the table, and I hope if the person had a seat at the table, they weren't going around talking about what was occurring in the room. You do try to keep it confidential for the very reason that it is a very, very open process between the parties. So the school district has representatives sitting around the table, and the union has representatives sitting around the table. As board president and union president, Jack Kelly and I always had an agreement that No matter how acrimonious it may become in the room, and sometimes it does get heated in the room, we would remain very professional. It was something that you work through. At the end of the day, you end the process, the lawyers go home, and you end up working through the terms of the contract. I did want to address some things that Bill raised, because maybe some of you don't understand what the grievance process is. So as Bill noted about the grievance process, the grievance occurs if something happens within the day-to-day world that perhaps the union representatives or a staff member comes to the union rep and says, something occurred, I don't know if if I have to do this or if this is required. And then the union will look at the contract. And if it's written in the contract and somehow it is in violation of what was agreed to, or they perceive it to be a violation, because not every scenario is spelled out in the contract. There is still that ambiguity, and therefore that could lead to a grievance whereby the union representative files a grievance on behalf of the staff member, the professional staff, and then there is a tier system. So it's just like parents are supposed to go to the teacher first, and then to the principal, and then up the chain. So too with the grievance process. If the union takes issue with something and is grieving it because they believe it is a violation of a particular section of the contract, then they will start first with the administrator, supervisor within the building, and then to the superintendent. And after that, if there hasn't been an agreement reached, they can take it to the board. That's a level 3 in Cheltenham. Some districts have level 4s. I mean, it depends on how many levels they have in terms of finding it. At that point, the board will hear the grievance and make a determination. If at that point the board does not support the position taken by the union then can go to arbitration and to court basically to take that position up. So there is a process that goes through, and that's why contract language, no matter how specific it gets, there can always be a scenario that occurs where there is ambiguity. And so I just want to stress that as much as the contract is bargained for, and it may seem like there's very specific language, something may come up where you're still questioning, well, is that really what the intent was? Is that really what was agreed to in the contract? So I hope that helps. At the IU, at the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit, does everybody know what the IU does? Pretty much, sort of.
You should speak to.
So the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit is one of 29 intermediate units in the state of Pennsylvania. We are, by statute, assigned to a specific region. So IU 23, Montgomery County Intermediate Unit, we have all of Montgomery County. We work with our public school districts as well as our private non-public schools. We work to support the schools. We work to provide remedial services. We start with age 3 for early intervention services, and we go all the way on up to age 21 with transition services for our special needs students. We also work in providing assistance to the school district, whether it be in the business realm, in the HR realm, in superintendent searches we've conducted. I work in the realm of building community, that's why I'm here, community relations, as well as government relations, so we do a lot of work with advocacy. I also spend a lot of time with school boards, not only in our IU, but also outside of the IU, and I do school board professional development. So I work with school boards on good governance and good practice. I served on the Pennsylvania School Boards Association as a director as well during my time as a school board member, and I've learned a lot through my experiences as a school board member, but even so, more so, learning and working with school board members from across the country. We meet regularly with our superintendents in Montgomery County, so I get a sense of what's going on in our community, in our region, and I can tell you that contract negotiations is never a fun time for either administration or union representatives. It is, it is a time that is stressful. It's interesting that we're having this meeting today, as you know, or you may have watched the news. The LA Unified School District currently is out on strike, and they have been negotiating for a while, and they finally went to strike. This is the first time they had to strike in 30 years. And so it is something that people do not want to do. I know from the board perspective, when I served on the board, it is not something that anyone is eager to do. We know the disruption. We know the disruption to the families, but more importantly, the disruption to the students. So it is not something that people strive to do. But there are matters that need to be tended to. And that's the important process with regard to working on the contract. And yes, the contract is something that is a binding document, and therefore you try to work through the terms, and whether it be monetary, benefits, other areas, anything can be bargained. It's a question of how much you want to bargain in any given contract year. Sometimes you let go some items because you have other things that really are far more important in the process. So I know that many of our school districts have started their process, some have just ended, and it's an ongoing, depending on when their contracts are up. Yes?
So can you speak from your experience looking across the region? What role does collaboration, like a district that has a superintendent that is working collaboratively with the union or teachers versus a school district where there's contention between the two groups and what those contracts tend to look like?
So either way, so the question was about whether there's a difference between the superintendent unit that work collaboratively or whether there's tension between the superintendent and the union.
The quality of the contract that results when you have those types of
actually, I don't know if they can make that connection, because there are times when the group as a whole, when they're sitting at the table, that they want to get it done. And so it depends on what the issues are.
The group meaning the superintendent?
Both groups.
Right.
Both groups want to get it done. And Bill, do you want to say that one? Answer that one?
I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I have a little bit of experience in this. And I'm not so sure if it affects at all the type of contract you end up with. I think it does, though, affect the type of negotiations that you have. Part of our role, in addition to contract negotiations, is we have training sessions where we teach people how to talk to each other and how to, because although you have differing opinions, if you don't listen to the other side's opinion, you're never going to get to a deal. I found negotiations go a lot easier if the parties have a good relationship, because I'm not fighting grievances that have been going on for 3 years when I'm in that room at that point. I'm trying to actually get to a contract. But another thing that you have to remember is a lot depends on how much of a role the board allows the superintendent to take at negotiations. I've been in some negotiations where the superintendent, for all intents and purposes, is the dictator of the school district. I've been in others where they tell the superintendent, you don't even need to bother to come here because this is our job, not your job. Now, for the most part, you're somewhere in the middle. They take the feedback from the superintendent, but they make the final decision. But you can have a superintendent and a union who get along wonderfully, and a school board who doesn't get along wonderfully with the union. And I'm not saying who's right or who's wrong there, or the superintendent has ended up shuttled to the side, and it really plays no role at all. I hope that helped.
And that is very true.
Yeah.
We've seen examples of that not too far away from here, where it was the board that really took an aggressive stance, and they went several years without a contract, and it was not pleasant to watch. Yes.
Related to that, Tina, what has been the board role in Cheltenham typically?
So in my time, and I can only speak to the time that I was on the board, we had a team of 3 board members who sat at the negotiations table, and I was a member of that team, and we did talk, but we also had our council present, as does CEA. So in this district and in other districts, generally the union gets a UNISERV rep through PSEA to represent them if they choose to use the UNISERV rep. In Cheltenham and in other districts, they hire outside counsel. They pay for an attorney to represent them. So during our negotiations, during the time I was on the board, not only would it be the team of the board members and several from administration, but our council as well as the union's council. So, and I know she keeps quite busy. There is one attorney in particular that has represented a lot of unions in this region. So there's several attorneys who are known specifically for contract negotiations, and they are the go-to, and they are the ones that are used. In Cheltenham, the solicitor of the school district is from a separate law firm than the attorney that's retained for representation in contract negotiations. So,
Bill, does it change the nature of your job when there is a union with private representation as opposed to using the what did you say, UNISERV rep?
No, it really doesn't, because what you have to understand is these attorneys who are representing individual unions also represent ASME and SEA. We work with them at all of those places. We selfishly like to work with professionals, whether it's the UNISERV rep or an attorney. What really changes the nature of our job is when the board decides we're not bringing in an attorney and the union decides we're not bringing in a staff rep, we're going to do this on our own. It can oftentimes, they're very smart people and they're wonderful people. But this isn't what they do for a living. It becomes like herding cats often. It really does. It's just, but no, and one of the questions that was asked, is this unusual? It's not the norm, but this is certainly not the only school district that hires an outside attorney. And quite honestly, AFT locals who represent a number of school districts will typically have a staff rep and a lawyer at those negotiations.
It really is a matter of preference for the union and whether or not they want to bear the cost of a private attorney. And sometimes it becomes, a show of the 2 attorneys doing their best to represent the interests of their client. At the same time, there is a lot of back and forth that goes on. Sometimes not. Some meetings end up, you go home and you try again another day. Sometimes you get a lot done in one session. That's the bargaining process. It really is a give and take as to what the needs are. So, in turn,
Can I interject with another point of contrast between Cheltenham and some of our neighbors is we've had a fair number of different superintendents over the last several years, as opposed to, say, Abington that had a very long-standing.
That's an anomaly. Abington is an anomaly.
How does that, though, change, for either one of you, how does it change the dynamics? You know, if a superintendent walks in the middle of a contract, and then they have initiatives that they want to start, and so how does that impact the next contract negotiation, but then you have another superintendent, you know, how does that?
So let me just make it clear that nowadays, the average tenure for a superintendent is about 3 years, or 4 years in any school district. The longevity of our neighboring district with their superintendent, that truly is an anomaly. I will tell you that in Montgomery County alone, we just had our superintendent's meeting last week, and some of the superintendents were joking because they're now the old timers because we have so many new faces around the table. And so with each superintendent, they come in, hopefully when they're hired with goals in mind, the goals of the district, the goals of the school board, and that's driven by the needs within that district and the needs of the students. And they'll come in with ideas. That doesn't mean that they're gonna, tear apart everything that's done. It's a learning process, but there's constantly going to be a contract under negotiation, whether it's the teacher's contract or the support staff contract or an Act 93 agreement that has to be reviewed. That's for your administrators. So whether there's a new superintendent or not, they will take into account the needs of the district and why they were hired. They were hired to do a job.
I just have a question about that. The turnover rate of the superintendents, is that cost effective for the communities?
It's not cost effective.
Are they taking money with them?
It's not cost effective for superintendents to constantly change, but it's the nature of education today. I will tell you that it's true with educators in general. The stressors that are placed on the administration, on the teachers, to continually address the mandates that are driven by the state and federal government, make this a very different profession than it was years ago. And add to that, I will say that social media plays a huge part in the longevity of a superintendent. Social media has played a more significant role than you'll ever imagine. Social media can make or break whether it's a comfortable job or not. In some situations, if a superintendent is working 24/7 and it's still not enough in the eyes of the critics, why do you stay? You can move on to another place. And maybe it's not as contentious in that area. Maybe the parents aren't going to be showing up at board meetings all the time. Maybe the board will be different. The board drives a lot of what happens as well. But there is ever changing, just like there was a day years ago when people would stay at the same company and be happy to retire there. Those days are not today. People really do move around more than they ever did. So we're seeing a lot of change in education. It's why I got involved in government relations. It's because of my role on the school board that I realized how little we could do at the local level, and that we had to pay attention to what's happening at the state and federal level, because those decisions are really driving what's happening in the day-to-day classroom and what's happening to education as a whole. So I left my private practice in order to work in a realm where I can support and advocate for education. And I can tell you every day is a new battle with a new mandate that's coming down the road. I see a teacher who's shaking her head because she knows. It is a constant pressure, and that drives into the contract as well. The needs that were, or the requirements of staff, 5 years ago or 10 years ago may be very different based on new mandates that have come up that drive the work and drive the time that our professional staff have to put in.
I just wanted to point one thing out about long-term superintendents that may be missed when you think about it. Oftentimes, they will have a great working relationship with the president of the union, who is also long-term, and they settle a lot of problems, and a lot of grievances are settled with memos of understanding. This is what we think this means. And practices will develop over the course of years that are never brought up at the bargaining table because things are going well. And that's great. I support that 100%, except when that superintendent leaves and the board now says, wait, we didn't know any of this stuff. What are you talking about? It makes bargaining almost impossible. And I'm not going to talk about specific cases, but believe me, most of the crazy ones that I end up involved in have to do with after a long-term superintendent leaves. And the board's not lying. They didn't know a lot of that stuff because they let the superintendent run the district. Everything was going well. When they found out now they need to change everything, and because of status quo rules, they can't.
Right. And also, the MOU process, Memorandum of Understanding, so throughout the time your contract is alive, so during the term of the contract, there are times when the parties can meet and they can enter into a Memorandum of Understanding as to a change. That then, at the next contract negotiation, could be a point that is included in the next contract. So the MOU definitely can make or break an item that may go into the next contract. If you have different players at the table, they may not be in agreement with that, what occurred in that MOU. And then you start again. But that's how you resolve issues, is through an MOU. Yes?
I don't know whether this is accurate or not, but there's a reputation that our district has an incredibly detailed contract. So I was wondering if you guys could speak to the benefits and costs. You were talking about, there's always some gray area, there's interpretation of the contract. Is it helpful to have a contract that's so incredibly detailed? Is it more helpful to have a contract where there's some things left for interpretation? How does that change the negotiation process and then the grievances that come
Every
out of it?
contract is up for interpretation,
right.
no matter how detailed
Exactly
it is.
right.
I'm not making this up, and I'm not going to tell
So
you,
true.
but in my previous life, when I was a union representative, I shared representation of a company with another local union, and we used to go to grievance mediation. And I'm not making this up. I'm not going to tell you the specific issue, but it was really this example is exactly like that. Let us assume that person had a grievance from one of his members that said, that chair is red. He would go in and fight like hell to prove that that chair was red. And then the next grievance he took in was from a different member that said, that chair is blue. And with a straight face, he tried to say the chair was blue. I mean, just because you write something in a contract doesn't mean people are going to pay attention to it. That's why you have a grievance procedure. But I can't answer about specific contracts, and I don't know if your contract is more specific than others. And if I did, I couldn't tell you. But I will tell you that my experience is contracts that gets very specific have had issues that have come up during the terms of those contracts that people have then talked about at the bargaining table and put very specific language in to cover those things. When things are going well, you can have a 4-page contract, really, that concentrates on wages, and as long as people weren't fighting, they don't fight about those things at bargaining. You always have the guy or woman who has nothing else to do but read the contract and find things they wish they were in there, even though it has nothing to do with how the district or the union have been running. But for the most part, when people are getting along, you don't have real specific things in agreement. Those things that get real specific are a result of fights or disagreements that people have had during the term of a contract.
For Cheltenham, I don't want to say that that was truly about,
That's not what I'm
a
saying.
fight or anything of that nature. It may be, as I said, the MOU process that then makes it so that you would put it into the contract. You want to be specific because it was something that was agreed to during the course of the last contract term. And so it builds. It builds through
Does it always
time.
build, or do people also go and start taking some language out?
If you take language out,
It always just gets added to.
well, it is very difficult to take language out. And you have to, for everything that you bargain, there's a price to it. Whether time or money, there's a price to it. And so as you chip away at things, there's a price to that as well. And so, you know, as much as people don't want to hear it, budget comes into play. The administration is looking at the budget. They're looking at how are they going to support the terms of the contract, salary, benefits, the step schedules. You know, you have a lot going into your budget. Majority of your budget in the school district is salary and benefits. That's true for any educational entity. It's salary and benefits. But you also have to take into account all the other parts of the budget. You know, the lights have to run, the heat has to be on, the you know, you have to have buses. There are things that have to be included in that. That's not even including all the mandated items that you have to do by law. And so you have to factor that into the process too. So going into collective bargaining means looking at where you are in totality, what your district goals are, and how you accomplish that during the terms. But I can tell you that when I first started on the board, I remember things being said and I'd be like, well, doesn't everybody know that? And I was, you know, it was almost like a saying, well, if it's not written down, people don't know. You can't assume that everybody knows. So sometimes that's another reason to be a little more specific in your language. I don't know if we are or aren't more specific than other districts, but every district is unique. Every district has different needs. Every district has started in a different way, a different process. I just spoke to a superintendent last week who was very, very dismayed about how their contract negotiations went. And it was very surprising because that it had never happened before. And this is someone who wasn't a new superintendent. So it doesn't just happen that difficult contracts happen because it's a new superintendent. You can have seasoned superintendents who have a difficult year one year in contract negotiations. Yes.
So, if the public is not really involved in the negotiation, is there a way for the public to at least understand what the issues are in the negotiation and in some way at least make their sentiments known? And just for context, I'll speak for myself. Our last contract negotiation in this district, which was not that long ago, felt, at least from my perspective, and I think a lot of other people's, quite contentious. And it also, and I'm definitely speaking for myself here, it felt like the only ones who may have truly been suffering were the kids. I felt like they were right in the middle of it, and it was just so contentious, and they were the ones who were suffering. And I just felt so helpless. I felt like I had no way to convey that outside of showing up at a board meeting and waiting until 10 o'clock at night to say, let's all be adults here. Let's think about the kids. And so I'm just wondering, we're not in the room, we don't know what's going on. How can we at least, is there a way for us to at least impart our concern and our thoughts about the whole process and how it's going and what we hope at least, not specifically is achieved, but from a general sense, achieved for the welfare of our own kids?
Well, I will say that, you know, we have a representative democracy. It's why you elect your school board members. They're the ones who are there to represent the community as a whole. The problem with trying to address snippets of a contract or trying to educate everybody on every nuance or need of the contract means that you're taking whatever's being discussed outside of the room. And I know it is frustrating. Believe me, as a board member, it was very frustrating to not be able to speak to people and explain what was going on. It is very uncomfortable. And you know that, you know, you want it to be resolved and you want it to be resolved in a good way. But, you know, bargaining is not a pleasant process all the time. You know, it means that there's a lot of hard work that goes into it, and trying to educate people about things that they may not completely have the full picture on makes it all the more difficult. Hence, it stays in the room, and it's really difficult to explain to parents how to be more involved in that process. As a matter of fact, if you opened it up, it could open up an unfair labor practice claim against the party. So you don't want that to happen either. There's a fine line about what you can say and what you can't say.
I'm not going to tell you people aren't going to tell you what's going on, because oftentimes they will. But I will also tell you to take that with a grain of salt.
Absolutely.
Because both parties, while educating you, are much more interested in gathering your support than they are in being as open and honest as possible. It doesn't mean they're lying. That means they think it's important. They think the position they're taking is the right position, and it's important for you to support them in that position. That being said, I've noticed more lately that people are at least coming out and saying, look, the problem is healthcare, and they're saying it at a board meeting, and they're saying it to the public, and then the union, of course, is coming in and telling at that same meeting, standing up at public comments and saying what they think the problems are and why they can't accept what the board wants. Let me give you an example. The one that always jumps at me is premium share for healthcare. Okay? You will hear from citizens that we all pay part of our premium share for our health care. These teachers should pay premium share for their health care. I don't have a disagreement with that. I just think you need to be realistic about what's happening, because I will tell you that most school districts in the state now pay a premium share for health care, but when they agreed to that premium share, I will guarantee you that there was enough money put in their salary to make up for it. So in fact, most of that is cosmetic. It really is. So someone can say, we're making them pay premium share, and so the union can say, we're contributing to the cost. But under the present status quo rules, if they were actually going to lose money, why would the union ever agree to it when they can just keep coming to work under the previously existing terms and conditions of employment? So if you want premium share because you have a philosophical position that they have to pay it, that's fine. But don't think when you get premium share, all of a sudden you're saving money, because you're paying for it somewhere else.
And what Bill said is true. I would caution every parent to be very careful as to what is said by people. Yeah. And this is not anything negative about our union, our professional staff. I love them dearly, always have, always supported them. But if someone has not been seated at the table and does not have the full picture, they don't know what is being discussed, or what they may guess, they may think, they may be presented an overview at a union meeting, but they don't know all the nuances of all the other things that are being discussed. So sometimes you have to be careful that you don't become a pawn in the process, in the political process of bargaining. And there are times when I was on the board that I wished I could have responded to things, but there really was a deal that we would not discuss it. And we did not want to breach that confidentiality as we were working toward an agreement. And so it is frustrating. I get it. I know. I was there when, we've had a strike in this district. Not during my time, but before that. And so I've seen acrimonious years and I've seen good years. I've seen fact-finding. I've seen mediation. I've heard it from many other school districts. It is a very difficult process. A lot of things will be said, and there won't be people who are always happy with what comes out at the end. But it's a process that you work through. Remember what I said. Each side walks away with something they can live with. Not everyone within the group will be happy, but it is something that the parties, the people who had the ability to work through the details, could walk away with at the end. And when presented to the group for ratification, because there has to be a ratification of the agreement, it's presented at the union through the union leadership, and the union members vote to ratify, and then it comes to the school board, and the school board has to agree to it. So to the extent that people aren't happy with particular terms that have been agreed to, they were bargained for. And this was the middle ground that could be reached. And as we're seeing now in LA, there is times when that middle ground just can't be reached. And it becomes ugly, and it becomes a process that everyone dreads, because again, it's not helping anyone. It's not helping the parents, it's not helping the students, but it is something that feels that they need to advocate for on one side or the other. Yes.
I mean, thank you for, just being brutally honest about what is, not great about it, and it's tough and frustrating. And, it can sometimes feel like, oh gosh, why do we even persist in public education? I'm just gonna run to a private school. Not that I'm going to, but I'm curious, like, when you zoom out historically, like what I trust that there, and I do know from a historical perspective, there is a value in all of us, grappling with the difficulties of negotiation in a way that, so can you speak to the benefits for students that you have seen historically, maybe not just in Cheltenham, but in general, thanks to this process? Like, hopefully there are some bright spots and make it all worth it, right? I mean, I think so. I'm married to a teacher, so but I like zooming out historically, like what are some of the things that...
benefits to teacher is that we have wonderful staff that work with the students on a daily basis. I mean, that's the goal in keeping the roof over your head. It is truly a multi-million-dollar business, and at the end of the day, your product is what's in the best interest for the students in the district. And so you want to make sure that your students have staff members that will be there for them. At the same time, you have to balance that with what the students are required to have. And again, the mandates coming out of the state, the federal government, make that even more difficult, because they're dictating in many ways what the outcome should be.
Two things. First, we have 500 school districts in this state. The vast majority of those districts settle their collective bargaining agreements without a strike. We have, for the past 15 years, set records for the fewest amount of strikes in the state of Pennsylvania. But I think this is what my answer addresses the question you were asking. There are advantages to a district to having their teachers organized. You have people who officially represent everyone for every problem that comes up. Instead of having, if you have 200 teachers, instead of having 200 people fighting about 200 different things, you have an established process, especially when you've been organized for a while and you've built up a relationship where you can solve these problems, and you don't have the nitpicking going on every day. And I will also tell you this. I've sat in a lot of teacher negotiations. As an old industrial unionist, it took me a long time to get used to this process, because, when I bargained with Pepsi, we were either get what we wanted from Pepsi or we were going to try and make them hurt. I will tell you that every teacher's bargaining committee where I have been in negotiations, the teachers spend a lot of time telling me how we have to do this because it's right for the students. And I spend a lot of time telling them, that's the school board's position. You're here to represent the teachers. But I will tell you, by and large in Pennsylvania, the teachers that I've dealt with care about students, and that has to count for something.
Kat?
Yeah, I was just wondering what the community can do. If we can't know about what's happening, because I totally get that. I think to Michael's question, we're sort of left out in this process, it sounds like, and it feels a little bit like, what do we do? So we really can't do anything.
I'm going to let you get to that.
What can we do?
You make better choices with the school board.
It's not necessarily the school board. This is a process. It is truly two sides going to work together to determine what they need to do to provide and meet the needs of the educational process and the goals. I mean, the goal setting is very important, but to the extent that the parents feel like they don't have a role, you do have a role. You support your student, you support your staff members, your professional staff, and you also don't second guess armchair quarterback based on rumor. That helps the process a lot because, as I said, people do read social media and comments do hurt. And when it gets hurtful in that arena, it plays out in what happens in the bargaining room. It does. And so I'd say be respectful in the process and don't try to guess what's happening, or don't listen to rumor, because rumor isn't always fact. And I think, this is my whole philosophical thing nowadays. People are more prone to listen to rumor than they are just allowing the process to continue the way it should be and could be, working through this whole process. It is not an easy time. I get it. And I get that you want to be there for the betterment of the district. As to the school board, if you're interested, you have 5 seats up for election. I don't see a groundswell of people stepping up to be school board members. There's not a huge rush at the door. It is not an easy job. And I can say that because I was one for 8 years, and I always say I'm in recovery right now. I give the greatest respect to anyone who serves on a school board. It is an unpaid position, and it takes a lot of stamina. There are a lot of meetings. There's a lot of work. And for most of us, you have another job. And if you have children at home, you have another job. So it is not an easy task, but it is one of the most rewarding because you are making a difference in your community. So if you care deeply and you want to be involved in the process, then I suggest that you sign up and look to see how you can run for office. And I will be more than happy to speak to any of you after the meeting if anyone is interested in finding out how you can run for school board.
When you first started, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
When you first started with the school board, what
Yes.
were your ambitions like?
My ambitions for what?
For making a difference,
For making a
within the
difference?
district? Yeah.
I think I did make a difference in
Yeah.
serving on the board. From the time I started, we had buildings that were falling apart. They were crumbling. Myers Elementary was falling apart. Glenside Elementary was falling apart. Cheltenham Elementary was falling apart. We now have new buildings. I left at the conclusion of Wincote. So our goal was to ensure that our buildings were a safe place, but also met the needs of the changing technology. Think about the technology that you all take for granted now with your children. We didn't have that when I started. And so look at this building. These are the things that, I want to see progress in my community. I'm a product of Cheltenham. I'm a proud graduate of Cheltenham. I'm on the board for the Alumni Association, so if there's any alums out there, I will also speak to you about that, because we're looking for more alums to get involved. But my children went to this school district, and during my time on the board, I saw a lot of great things happen with children. I always told my fellow school board members, and I still say this to the day when I work with my school boards across the region, that the greatest payday for any school board member is graduation day. That's what you strive for, is to make sure that each and every child that gets that diploma goes out into the world prepared. And that's the goal. So do I think I helped affect good change in Cheltenham? I do. And I commend all my fellow board members and the board today. I have great respect for board members, and this is School Board Recognition Month, so say thank you to your school board members. They work really hard. They don't just represent you in this district, but they serve on other committees elsewhere. They come out to the IU. They get involved with the School Boards Association. They get actively involved in making a change at the legislative level and advocating for what's in the best interest of children. And unfortunately in Cheltenham, we do have a lot of constraints because of our taxes. And it puts a real push-pull between the parents in the district and the rest of the community who do not have children in the school system. And that is also a big issue that we contend with on a daily basis. We're working on a campaign right now. I'm going to put in my plug. I know it's not about collective bargaining, but it's PA Schools Work. You can go on the website, and it's about asking for more adequate funding from the state level because the burden has shifted predominantly to the local level. And that's where the contract talks come into play when you're looking at salary and benefits, when you know that the dollars have to go around and you're not going to get any more from the state. So in this region, very few of our districts get any more than 15 to 18% support from the state. The rest is born from the local support.
I have nothing to do with funding.
But that all drives into contract talks. When the economy is bad and you know you're relying on your local base, it's very difficult going into a contract year as a school board member when you know, I happened to be on the negotiating team during the year we had the Great Recession. Imagine how that felt going into negotiations, knowing that there were people, including at the time my spouse, who had lost their job. It's not a pleasant time to go into negotiations, but it's something you have to do because the contract has to be negotiated. So there are a lot of things that you can do to support and continue to support the schools. The fact that you're here tonight, the fact that you're involved means that you're helping to make a difference in your child's life.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Two questions, actually. One is, once a contract is ratified, like we have access to the current contract, correct? So as concerned citizens and parents, we could actually review what's out there in the current contract, and if we wanted to voice our concerns and our opinions, again, we would do that to the school board or to the administration, or so that way they know going into the contract. I'm assuming that's one way we can get our voices heard. The other is, is there you talked about the process as far as fact-finding and mediation. Is there a time when one side or another is forced to resolve their differences, or no? So it could go on forever.
You can go, if you go on strike, you can, and you're forced back to work in order to get 180 instructional days by June 15th, you go to arbitration, but it's non-binding arbitration, okay? And then you can go on strike again, and you have to come back to work in order to get 180 days by June 30th. And then if you still don't get a deal, the whole process starts over the next year. So there's no binding arbitration. And quite honestly, the best way for people to get an agreement is to sit in a room and get an agreement, not have someone tell them what they should agree to.
But you answered part of my concern was, at some point, the teachers do have to come back to be able to get the 180 days
That's
of
correct.
instruction. So they're sort of forced, like to come back to be able to get the instruction in, even if they don't have a contract.
They have to get the instruction in.
Okay.
I don't want to get too legal because I'm not a lawyer, okay? But the 180 days by June 15th If they don't come back, the school board would have to go in and get an injunction to force them back to work. School boards don't like to do that because unions then will say, we want court-ordered bargaining, and the judge will, and I don't like it because I end up doing all the court-ordered bargaining, and the judge will start setting schedules when they have to meet. And while it sounds like that could be helpful, quite frankly, it's not. I've spent too many nights sitting in rooms with people staring at each other, not saying a word. People make deals when they're ready to make a deal. Now, the 180 days by June 30th, if they don't, the Department of Education will go in and get an injunction. Because if you don't get 180 days by June 30th, the school district's going to lose some of its state subsidy, and the teachers are then going to lose money. I mean, you know, when I first came on, I used to say, we don't have school strikes in Pennsylvania, we rearrange vacation. Because people always come back to work and get the time in and no one loses anything, except it inconveniences the hell out of parents. Someone said before about the kids are the only losers, and I won't get in a debate with you about that, but I think the people it affects most are parents who have children in school, because you have to rearrange your life because you've made your plans for childcare and everything else based on your kids being in school at that time, and all of a sudden they're not.
Right. Thank you.
Also, the status quo process, so everyone understands that after the contract ends at June 30th, if an agreement has not been reached, then you work to contract. So it's called working status quo, whatever was in the preceding contract. So as Bill mentioned before, sometimes the union will be quite content working under the preceding contract rather than have to renegotiate. And we know there's plenty of districts that have gone 2-3 years under status quo because they couldn't resolve their contract for the next term.
I know we have to get out of here, but let me just point a couple things out about status quo. A lot of people think, oh, the contract stays in force. The contract does not stay in force. The terms of the contract stay in force, and that's a big difference, and I'm going to tell you why it's a big difference. For example, most education contracts have teachers getting paid more for having more education or more college credits. They don't move on that scale during status quo. They won't get those raises. That's number one. For a support staff, usually you don't get step movement during status quo. Support staff contract may say people start at $2 an hour below the rate and get 50 cents a year for 4 years till they catch up, okay? They don't get that 50 cents a year because it's a snapshot of what they were entitled to right at that point. The other thing is there are really 2 court cases that govern status quo. One is an old Philadelphia Housing Authority case. I don't know the year, but it was Ed Rendell's first year as governor of Philadelphia. So you figure that out. Or mayor of Philadelphia. Okay, so you figure that out. But that says you can't implement an agreement until you're at impasse, and you're not at impasse until the union goes on strike, which would make you think if the teachers go on strike, you could implement a contract. You cannot. There is a Central Dauphin School District case that basically says, and I think it's fair, I really do, that basically says because those teachers are being forced back to work, you can't force them back to work under an implemented contract. If the bus drivers go on strike and they decide to implement the contract, nobody can make those bus drivers come back to work under that implemented contract until they decide to. So status quo, I think, under present case law, goes on forever for teachers, no matter what happens. I'm sorry.
To answer the question about the Cheltenham current agreement is available. It's buried deep in the website, and we can make that link on the UPG Facebook page along with the recording of this whole meeting. Some districts, we did our homework, and some districts have them available and some districts don't. I don't know what the nuances of that are, but just to directly answer your question, it is available. I want to thank both of you so very, very much for your time, for all the information that you've shared with us, and for driving all the distance to be here with us. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. And once we figure out how to get this posted, we will spread that word so you can let people know who weren't able to be here tonight. But thank you for coming. And please eat food so that it doesn't have to go back where it came from. Thank you.
One thing. I am the easiest person in state government to get on the telephone. I really am. I'm gonna leave some business cards up here. They have everyone in the state who I've met with has my cell phone number. That's where to find me. I'll leave these here. If anyone wants them, feel free to take one. I won't answer any specific questions, but if you ever feel the need to talk to someone from mediation, I'm the person to call. Call the cell phone. If you call my office, you're either going to get a secretary who's not going to know where I'm at anyhow, or with this new phone system, you may just never have anyone answer because you can't figure it out.
Thank you. Thank you both.